Hello class and welcome to Time Management Part 3. This is the first lecture from week 8. It's a 9-week semester, so you're approaching the finish line now, and this will be the last lecture from our section on time management. Previous lectures we looked at key ways of managing time and project schedules. We looked specifically at critical path methodology, and we also looked at Gantt charts. So this lecture we're actually going to take this a little bit closer to home, and we're going to be talking about time management in Kurdistan, and I'm going to stress again the importance, financially at least, of completing projects in a timely manner. I'm also going to be talking rather negatively about Kurdistan, just as fair warning, because in this area of project management, particularly time management, Kurdistan is a long way behind other parts of the world. Again, this is not an attack on Kurdistan generally. I think Kurdistan is doing absolute brilliant work in other fields. I'm just saying that in this particular field, there's a lot of room for improvement for Kurdistan. And so we're going to talk also about how that might happen. So this is an example I gave you 2 lectures ago, and also it's an example I gave you in engineering economics. The idea that Avan has been asked by a businessman to build a theme park, and Avan actually builds it at a cheaper price, but it takes longer. And the opportunity cost of it taking longer was greater than the savings she had made. So that's a very basic example to try and give you an idea of the importance of time management, because actually money is at stake, and when it's externalities, it's actually other people's money at stake too. Now this is a good example because it's so simple, and I think it illustrates the opportunity cost of time quite well. But the trouble with this example is it's very much made up. The rates are completely fabricated. And I want to try now to look at another example which is from the real world. So the example we're going to look at is Star Apartments. So if you don't know about Star Apartments, it's actually a project being built at the moment on Gulan Street, just outside Bakhtiari. Now, to give you, it's been going on for quite some time, this project. It's been taking several years to build, but they're progressing quite well at the moment. If you drive down Gulan Street, you can see it just outside the northern end of Bakhtiari Road. Now, when this apartment complex is completed, it's going to have 604 apartments. Now, some apartments are bigger and some apartments are smaller, so the rents will vary, but the average rent for an apartment will be about $900 a month. This is what I'm told by the real estate company Bagi Shaklawa. Now, to build it, they are also using 2 cranes. Now these cranes, they're being hired not on a fixed price contract, but on an hourly rate contract. They are costing the construction company, and by extension the developer, $15,000 every month. That's a typical rental fee for a crane. They're quite expensive. Also, the project management team, those working on the project management, they're earning salaries, which means they earn for the hours they put in. They get paid a fixed salary every month, and so they're not being paid just a fixed price for completing the project. And that's typical. There's usually elements of any project that have to be paid by rates or salaries. So the project management team, the entire team, they have a combined salary of $50,000 per month. Now, I want you to consider here what will be the cost of a delay in this project. Let's say there's a delay. Let's say there's a delay of 1 week. What is the lost value? Well, the lost value there is actually about $152,000. And remember, these values here, they do not include lost value for other people, potentially people who would want to move in, but they have a delay and so they've got to keep paying rents at hotels or whatever. Those are externality costs. Right now, I'm not even looking at external costs. I'm just looking at internal costs. A delay of 1 month will be over $600,000. 3 months, 1.8 million. 6 months, 3.6 million. And 1 year, it's over 7 million. That's just internal costs for a delay in the project. So if you start including external costs, it wouldn't surprise me if that value were to double. So that gives you some idea of the price of having slow, delayed projects. So let's have a look at a comparison here. This is another complex which was just finished. I think it was finished around May. So this is a complex being built in Guatemala City. It's called the Guatemala City Complex, and yeah, it's got about 600 apartments too. It's roughly the same size and type of as Star Apartments. Now, the entire construction time of these apartments was 9 months. The time it took them between breaking ground and the first tenants moving in was 9 months. Now, my question to you is, how long will it take Star Apartments to actually be finished and for people to start moving in? How long will the construction phase take? Well, I don't really know, but I think in the Kurdistan context, 9 months seems like a really fast turnaround. And this is quite sad. Look at Guatemala. Guatemala is a poor country. It's a developing country. It's got a lot more financial problems than Kurdistan. It doesn't have oil like Kurdistan has. In all manner of speaking, Guatemala shouldn't be able to outbeat Kurdistan in this area. So this is just as way of a comparison. I think I can point to examples which are amazing, like China, where they're building coronavirus hospitals for 10,000 patients in less than a week and so on, and that's incredible. But this is Guatemala. Kurdistan should seek to more than emulate, but beat Guatemala in terms of development, I would hope. Well, yeah, the last estimate, by the way, that I got, I did speak to Bagi Chaklawa. They say that it's going to take probably about 3 years. And that's what they're telling me. It's probably going to take longer than that. It's making pretty good progress at the moment, but there were long delays between building the foundation and the superstructure, huge delays. And so if it takes 3 years, I think it'll probably take longer than that. That is a lost value of $16.5 million. And that's just internal costs. External costs, I think a good estimate would be another 16 million. So this is a huge cost to Kurdistan. But the Star Apartments, they are not an abnormality in Erbil. There are projects all through Erbil where there have been huge delays in the delivery. So look at this one here. Where's that? That's Park View. Well, Park View was built several years back, but then very quickly they realised demand was outsourcing supply, and so they decided that they needed to build additional towers. Those additional towers there, they've been pretty stagnant in their construction, or yeah, they're taking multiple years to build. Another example here, we see this an awful lot where buildings will finish the superstructure, meaning they will make the skeleton of a high rise, but then there will be long delays in doing the masonry work, getting walls installed, and then also getting utilities and the final touches installed in the buildings. Now, all the time that building is sitting idle, someone is having to pay for that crane, just so you know. That's another one that's out towards Chihan City. Oh, this one's an interesting one. Where is this? This is actually this is called Tarrant Hills. This is a big development that there is a plan for this to happen just before you get to Massif. They started to break ground. They prepared foundation works. I think it's going to be many, many years before we have a complex that looks like that in Erbil. Yeah, I think the last, they keep revising the delivery date for that one, but at this stage, there's a big delay in the works, and nothing's happening. So basically, if this was a Gantt chart, imagine a huge gap emerging between the bars of various construction activities. That's Tarrant Hills, out towards American Village. And this is Floria City. Floria City is an interesting one. This is on the Kesnazan Road. So Floria City, when it's completed, it should be able to house around 500. There should be about 500 houses or dwellings, so including apartments. Now, when did this project begin? It began in 2011. Now, what happened? Well, they started working, not at a very fast rate, I'll have to say. And by 2014, when really anywhere else in the world the project would have been finished, there was a financial crisis, the price of oil dropped, investors pulled out, and suddenly they ran out of money. And so basically it's sitting vacant. There's very, very slow progress happening where basically individuals are coming along and buying villas and then fixing up the villas themselves. But in truth, I think Floria City, it wouldn't surprise me if it won't, unless someone comes in to sort it out with a lot of capital. That's just going to be sitting vacant for another 10 years, which is very sad. So this is a shopping mall in Ainkawa, which is still vacant. And the interesting thing is you have these empty building sites all through Erbil, where basically they were constructing them and then they just stop, and then construction may not start again for many months or indeed many years. Well, such a site is actually quite a good place to put refugees. So during the refugee crisis, when many people were coming up from Mosul, the owner of this project, he actually allowed refugees to live on the construction site. And that's still happening. The UKH Charity Foundation actually has work helping refugees who live on a construction site next door to the Divan Hotel, for example. But the fact that these abandoned buildings, effectively abandoned, are all over Erbil, that is source of concern. Why did construction stop on them. And just so we're clear, I want you to understand that it's not just private projects that have very poor time management in Kurdistan. I've got a few examples here. The Permam tunnel, the tunnel that has just been opened, the one that goes to Shaklawa, a great tunnel that's going to really improve the economy. But do you know when that was meant to be finished? It was meant to be finished in 2015. It finished 5 years too late. It went 5 years over the deadline. The southern part of 120-meter road, that came 2 years late. The Gomaspan Dam, this is a dam being built just north of Erbil. It's going to provide irrigation for the farmland. That's currently 4 years behind schedule. I actually think it's much more than 4 years. I think they're saying it's 4 years. I think potentially it's closer to 5, just from some of the Gantt charts that I saw. But yeah, public works, there can be huge delays with the projects in Kurdistan too with these. Now, is there a cost associated with that? You betcha there is. But unlike private works, where the cost is both internal and external, public works, the cost is nearly always external. And usually the costs, if you actually try to add them up or do an economic analysis, it actually adds up to being considerably more. So all of this is costing Kurdistan considerably. You know, I was having a conversation with a colleague at UKH recently, and he was a colleague from the business school at UKH, and we were talking about the delays to infrastructure projects, and we were trying to work out together. It was just over lunch. This is not serious research we were trying to do. It wasn't a published paper. We spent an hour chatting about this, doing a few sums. We counted the number of projects that we could think of. We estimated the cost of a late delivery and how long they were being delayed. And we basically, my colleague basically said he came to this estimate. I estimate the slow delivery of infrastructure projects is costing the KRG economy $3 billion a year. So that gives you an idea of how much it's costing the KRG. Can you imagine what would happen if the KRG government and the economy, there was more than $3 billion extra floating around in the economy every single year? You just can't imagine it. The KRG would be a completely different place. It would be looking a lot more like Dubai suddenly than like Baghdad. It's incredible. Now, obviously, even just stating something like this can actually put you in jeopardy, because basically what I'm doing here is I'm not only criticizing Kurdistan, I'm criticizing the government, I'm criticizing a lot of things about the Kurdish economy. And so I'm putting my career at risk by stating this. So the colleague that I was working this out with, he asked for me to hide his identity. So that's what I'm doing there. But the good news for Kurdistan is that there are times when you do get it right. The US consulate, that was built in Ainkawa, that was finished very quickly, 2 months ahead of schedule. The northern 120-meter road, the southern and the northern part of the 120-meter road, those were 2 different contracts, 2 different contractors. That was finished 5 months ahead of schedule, apparently. So there's 2 examples, a private project and a public project, which prove that Kurdistan, if she really wants to, it can do time management well, and it can deliver projects ahead of schedule and save money. So I guess now that we've established that time management is really bad in KRG, we need to ask, why is it so bad? And I'm going to go through a few key points here. I'm going to talk really about the key one, liquidity problems. So remember, we talked about this in cost management. So if you remember what I was saying, that it's not just enough that a project needs to be profitable, and not necessarily for the sponsor. The profit or gains or benefits can actually be experienced by external third parties. But also a project needs to be liquid, meaning that you have the ability to pay the debts of a project in a timely fashion. If you can't do that, basically you run out of money and you can't continue with the project. That is the main reason, I think, for a lot of delays in projects, both private and public projects in Kurdistan. And in many ways, this is a problem that isn't an engineering problem. This is a banking problem, and I'll talk a little bit about this. There's the banking system in Kurdistan and Iraq generally is incredibly weak. I'll also talk about investor relations because of the weak bank lending criteria. And also, I hope to touch on Islamic banking too. Now, there's a lot of good things about Islamic banking. As a non-Muslim, I can definitely appreciate a lot of the aspects that are around Islamic banking. But there is one key problem with Islamic banking, that it can cause liquidity issues, and that's why there is actually, with large projects, it does have a tendency to cause delays, very expensive delays to large infrastructure projects. And that's around all of the Muslim world where Islamic banking exists. And even though the majority of banks in the KRG are not Islamic banking banks, the KIB and IBL and others, it still has an effect because it's present in the current economy. I'll get to that later. Poor scheduling. It was very interesting in last week's tutorial that Taba, you mentioned Gantt charts. Do we actually really need to know these? Do people actually use them? And that was a completely legitimate question, but from my perspective, I found that quite amazing because I've seen Gantt charts since I was 12 years old. We use them for everything, for planning our work schedule through the weeks and various other things. I grew up with them and I use them all the time in engineering. But after talking with Taba in that tutorial, I actually phoned up a couple of my civil engineering friends who work in industry in Erbil, and yeah, a couple of them had never actually heard of what a Gantt chart is. If you don't plan your time, you're going to misuse your time, aren't you? And so basically that can lead to big delays in time management, in time and project delivery. So that's poor scheduling. Scope changes. There does this is something I heard from other people who work in projects. They say there is a very big tendency with big scope changes happening in projects. It's happened all over 120 metre road. I don't know if you've ever gone to Ainkawa Mall on 108 metre road. There's a funny bridge that you've got to go over and the bridge takes you over 120 metre road, and then you can go into the northern Ainkawa district. But it's a funny shape. It's in the shape of a big L, and it's completely inappropriate. It's the wrong shape. Why is it that shape? Well, it's because it was first intended to be a way that you could do a U-turn on a 120-meter road. But now they're realizing actually there was more need and demand for actually getting people across the road from one end of Ainkawa to the other. And so the bridge is basically of lower quality because of the scope change. And that had a lot of time delays with it too. We're also going to talk about free land problems, building reviews and government approvals, and also something called a white elephant creation. That's a phrase in English, a white elephant. What it means is it's something that nobody asked for, but you got it anyway. So we'll talk about that too in a little while. So let's start off with liquidity problems. Now, in Iraq, I can't find the figures for Kurdistan. I don't think it's much better than Iraq, though. 7% of Iraqi adults have a bank account. Now, that is absolutely incredibly low globally. That is just Iraq by far has the lowest proportion of its population having bank accounts. It's incredible. Even in Zimbabwe, now this is an impoverished third world country in the heart of Africa. My mum's Zimbabwean. I found the stats: 80% of all adults have bank accounts. And if you look at all other countries, very, very few countries have less than 50%. It's really some very backward and very corrupt countries which have it lower than that. Iraq is by far at the bottom of the world index for proportion of adults who keep their money in bank accounts. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that the banks have very little money in their safe at any given time. How do banks make their money? Well, banks make their money traditionally by taking your money. If you wanted to keep your money in the bank would take the money and they would pay you interest for the privilege of keeping your money. So my bank account in New Zealand, I'm currently getting 4% interest. I have $1,000 in the bank account. In a year's time, it's going to be about $1,050 because of the 4% interest. And then they take the money that you've given them and they will lend it out to people who want to use the money for projects. And they will then be charging those people an interest rate which is slightly higher than what they are paying people who are putting a deposit in the bank. And that's how banks make their money. That's how they do it worldwide. This is very basic, rudimentary maths and financial systems that the rest of the world learns in primary school. But in Kurdistan, the banks are so weak, a lot of people don't actually realize this. Now, if only 7% of Kurds are putting money into the bank, it's probably a tad bit higher. The bank has very limited funds to lend people. And so normally for any sort of project, for any project of any given size, you need to borrow money. When I wanted to buy a house in New Zealand, I didn't have the 200,000. It was actually in US dollars. It was about 150,000 US dollars. I didn't have that money on me. I had some money, but not all of it. The remainder I had to borrow from the bank, and that was just for a house. What if you're building the star apartments? Bank lending has to come into the equation. It has to. And you don't care about paying the bank back and paying the mortgage fee back and the interest, because you will be making money from the rent that you would be and from selling the apartments at Star Apartments. The same is true actually with public works projects too. Public works, If a country wanted to build a big motorway similar to a 120-meter road in one of its major cities, often the government will borrow money from the bank. And the government doesn't worry about getting into debt because it's done its due diligence and it realizes, well, if we build this motorway, it's actually going to stimulate the economy. People are going to be able to pay more taxes, and in return, we can pay back the debt to the bank. We can service the debt. So it's not just a private project problem, it's a public project problem too. Here, the government can't do that. The government does borrow small amounts from the KIB bank at times, but it's very small amounts. It can also borrow money from international banks like the World Bank, but it's very small amounts. Now, one of the big issues, why do so many Iraqi adults not have bank accounts? Well, one of the big issues is corruption. That people do not trust the banks. I have a friend who's Scottish. His name is Iskender. His Scottish name is Sandy, but he's lived in Kurdistan now for approaching, what's it been, 29 years. He moved here in 1991. And he's running an NGO here. He's translating the Bible into Sorani and other languages. But he had money in the bank, in the KIB bank. And what happened in 2005? He went to withdraw money from the bank, and he found out that someone else had taken the money. The government had seized his funds and said, we need this because of the war. He never got that money back. Now, I don't want to get into politics and about the right and the wrong of that, but you've got to realize where people think the government might do that, even in the most unusual and most pressing scenarios, they're not going to keep their money in the bank. I have to have a bank account in Iraq because it's part of my job contract. My UKH pays me into an Iraqi bank account. The Lebanese bank, the International Bank of Lebanon. But the moment I'm paid, I do what all my other colleagues do. I go to the bank and I withdraw all of the money, and I keep my money in a safe. And I feel more secure with my money than I would if I left the money in an Iraqi bank account. And when I can, I send the money to New Zealand, where I can earn interest. Personally, I would much rather have money in Iraq, in Kurdistan, being used to stimulate the economy here. I would feel good about myself, but it's just not happening. So there's low levels of trust. The other reason is there is no interest. Now, interest is outlawed in Islamic banking, but even non-Islamic banks, they have a tendency, because of the culture that and the rates which Islamic banking has set for the region because of supply and demand. Usually there is no to little interest for keeping your money in the bank. In fact, actually for me it's negative because they keep charging me fees for the privilege of holding my money, which is completely opposite to the way the rest of the world works. Normally, I give money to the bank and they pay me in interest for the privilege of holding my money. That's the way it usually works. It's opposite here. So if there's no interest, I have no incentive whatsoever to keep money in the bank. My only incentive is potentially if I think the bank is safer at protecting my money than myself, which, because of issues of low levels of trust and how governments have historically stolen money from people's bank accounts historically here, most people don't believe that. So I can tell you too that in New Zealand, I never knew anyone who owned a safe. But here, if I there are shops that specialize in selling safes. It's quite unusual for me. I've never seen it, if you can believe it, because the banks work. Why would you have a safe when you can just put the money in the bank and earn interest? So that's the issue with banking. Now, these are issues that engineers cannot fix, I have to say, but when you've got low levels of banking, it's very hard to borrow money, and that means that a lot of projects run into liquidity problems where basically their capital line dips below their expenditure line, like we did 2 weeks ago. So, what do people do when they can't get money for their projects from banks? Well, they normally turn to private investors. And private investors, they are a little bit few and far between. Remember, these investors have the same issue with borrowing money from banks as project developers and infrastructure developers. And so usually investors in for big projects, you need multiple investors with small amounts of money, rather than because it's quite hard to make money if you're not entrusted with money, which banks do. So there's very low levels of trust I've found in Kurdistan. What I usually notice is that, and I think a lot of this is probably down to very poor contractual agreements and a very poor justice system, where basically if one of you wanted to start a business and you approached me for if I would invest in the business, I would probably consider it, but I'm going to be very skeptical about whether or not I'm going to see a return on my investment, but also if things go sour, will I be protected? Will I be paid first? And there's very poor contractual law and also government law in this regard. So there's very low levels of trust. Everyone is often very scared, particularly in building projects. If someone comes to you and says, "I want to build a hotel, it's going to cost 5 million, will you invest?" and you say, "Okay, I'll give you $50,000 towards it and have a 10%, sorry, a 1% share." Yeah, 1% share. Well, what's stopping that person from taking the 50,000 and disappearing, leaving Kurdistan and disappearing? People are actually scared of that. And so normally the only people who are willing to invest with people building infrastructure projects are family members. So this is called tribalism, where basically the only people you can trust are people from your immediate family or immediate tribe. And that, of course, stifles investment and causes liquidity problems in the economy generally, because you've got a very limited pool of people who would be willing to invest with you. And it also creates all sorts of issues with inequality and racism. People will start wondering, if people will start resenting you if your name is Barzanji or Desai because you're from one of the big wealthy families, and so forth and so forth. It creates all sorts of social issues. As I said, often with private investors, there is a natural tendency in Kurdistan, often for informal agreements or handshake agreements to be placed, and nothing is written down in a contract with all of the terms and conditions. Now, that means that's all the more reason why often only family members are willing to invest on a handshake. I did speak to someone about this because I had just witnessed about a $15,000 investment take place between two businessmen who were both friends of mine, and there was no paper, there was no contract signed, they just shook hands. And I asked about this afterwards, and someone said that basically, when you are forming a new relationship, uh, if you start talking about potential problems, what if we have this kind of conflict where I want to spend more money for high quality, you want to save more money, and yeah, how are we going to resolve that? Basically, things that a contract would resolve, you're basically cursing the relationship when you start talking about potential problems you might have. And so usually people don't make formal agreements. And that's the same with employment generally. Most people are employed in Kurdistan with informal agreements. There's very little CVs, there's very little paperwork. Human resource departments are more or less invisible or non-existent. Now, so that's a cultural thing with Kurdistan. Now, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but a cost of that is that there's going to be less people willing to invest. And also, because they are worried you're just going to take their money and run off, they want to see progress before they invest. So imagine this. Imagine someone comes to you with a piece of paper with a picture of a high-rise apartment block, and they say, I'm building this, it's going to cost around 3 million, do you want to invest? I hear you've got some money. You're going to be a little bit reluctant to do that if all you see is paperwork, because you're worried maybe he's going to run off with the money. But you're also really worried about when you're going to see a return on the investment. Because remember, progress is really, really slow with projects here. And you don't want to invest in a project where you're not going to start seeing rents for another 5 years. That's a big issue. And so normally people are only wanting to invest after they see progress. So this means that getting money from private investors is usually done in phases. You get a little bit of money and then you build the foundation. Then when people see the foundation, you can raise a little bit more money, and then you can build the superstructure. When people see the superstructure, more people might be willing to invest, and you can do the masonry walls, and then finally the services. So that progress, where basically getting the funds is really stop-start, that is going to slow down the project considerably. It also means that funds dry out in economic crises because it's informal agreements. If an investor says, "Yeah, I will give you so much money when you reach this phase of the building or the bridge or whatever it is you're building," if there's an economic crisis, he might just disappear. And a lot of the KRG government and the KRG economy is very much dependent on the price of oil, which is not looking good for the KRG actually for the next 10 years. Finally, this is particularly important for international investors. Iraq is seen as a high-risk country. Now, I know this is Kurdistan, but as far as the rest of the world is concerned, you're Iraq. Kurdistan is not seen as being different. So when people think of investing in Iraq, what do they think of? They think of Mosul. They think of Daesh. They think of poverty in Basra. They think of pollution in Baghdad, and sectarian violence in Mosul and Kirkuk. That's what they see on the news. And so that's a real turn-off to private investors. I will say that the KRG Chamber of Commerce and also the Ministry of Economic Development, they're doing a really good job, particularly in Erbil, as presenting Erbil as being very distinct from many of the other problems that people associate with Iraq. And that's attracting international investors, particularly from China at the moment. So the government is doing a good job at addressing that. But as I said, usually investment requires the need, and people are only willing to invest if they see progress. Now, this is because we've talked about project risks and the project risk of Iraq being a risky place because of Mosul, because of Daesh. I can tell you as an investor, and I've invested in a few different projects myself, that by far the biggest risk that I see as an investor in a private infrastructure project such as an apartment block in Erbil is not the risk of Daesh, not the risk of the oil crisis or whatever. My biggest risk is actually time delays in the project. If you're building $1 million apartment block and I've invested 100,000 into it, I'm going to be very concerned whether the project is going to be complete and people will be living and paying rent in 1 year or in 5 years. That is massive for me. And so basically, because projects take such a long time, investors are very wary and circumspect in investing, and they only want to invest if they're seeing progress and development on the project, because they're thinking, yes, this will be finished first, it's being progressed at a good rate, and only then are they willing to invest. But this is the ironic thing. It means that investment, or getting the investment, that is often done in phases. So this is an example. For the foundation for a high-rise apartment, you need to have $200,000. The superstructure, another $300,000. Masonry, $400,000, and the fit-out and utilities, that's a further $100,000. And because people are only willing to invest as they see progress, that actually slows down the progress, because it means you need to keep stopping your work as money dries out, and you need to go looking for new investors. That is a huge delay in projects in Kurdistan. That is one of the real big reasons why a lot of projects, they seem to be stopped indefinitely at the superstructure. You just see these skeletons of buildings sitting all around Erbil. That is so common. And yeah, it's an ironic thing. People won't invest because buildings are very slow at being built, and so they want to see progress. But then because of that, it actually slows down the progress even more. So it's a vicious cycle. This is by far one of the biggest reasons for project delays in private projects anyway in Erbil. And then what happens when there's an economic crisis? Well, you saw this in 2014. I don't know if you can remember, guys. I wasn't here, but apparently 2011 to 2013, it was really the golden era for Erbil. A lot of people were saying there were buildings being built left, right, and centre. It was very easy to find work. Salaries were good, and then 2014 happened. Now, a couple of things happened in 2014. There was Daesh, but the real big thing was actually the price of oil collapsed. And then suddenly, a lot of the investors who had their money in oil, they just couldn't pay for these projects. And so they just stopped indefinitely. This is actually a result of weak contract law and weak justice systems. Investors, they need to be protected by the law. so that people can't steal their money. But equally, if people invest money into you, you need to be protected that they will continue to give the money that they say they would. And so you need a good law system and a justice system to be able to sue people who wrong you financially. And so a good example of this is Justice Tower. So this was being built. I think construction on this started in 2011, and it was the project due date for it to be finished and people moving in July 2016. I don't think anyone's in that building at the moment. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done on Justice Tower before it can be used. And so basically they ran out of money in 2014 because of the economic crisis, which is a real shame because there's a real need for office apartments throughout Erbil. Now this is an interesting thing because the oil price has crashed again, even more than it did in 2014. So 2020, are we going through another economic crisis? And are we going to see similar delays in projects that we saw before? It's seen as a high-risk location, so political instability, very weak protection laws, lots of corruption. That's actually a picture of the bomb attack in, I think it was 2015 or 16, I think, in Ain Kawa, outside the US consulate. That scares off investors. But as I said, as a key investor, by far the biggest risk for me is actually big time delays. If I'm investing in a shop, it's very important to me to know if the shop is going to be completed in 6 months or in 18 months, because that is a 1 year of potential revenue and profit. Just as that businessman was angry at Ivan when Ivan took longer to build the theme park. Time delays are the biggest risk. And so it's a vicious cycle. Investors don't want to invest in Erbil because of time delays, and because investors are slow to invest, that creates more time delays, and so it just gets worse and worse. So that's a big issue in Erbil. Now, this is a verse from the Bible. I'm not trying to evangelize here, but I just thought this would be a very interesting take on this. This is from the book of Luke. This is basically a biography about Jesus, where Jesus says to his disciples, "For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all will see it and begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build but was unable to finish.'" So the context of this is that Jesus is actually talking about the cost of being a disciple. When you become a believer, he's saying your life will not actually be happy and clappy. You will, if you are truly my believer, if you truly follow me, there will actually be a cost. You will be persecuted in this world for your faith. And so consider if you genuinely actually believe the claim that I'm making, because as I am going to the cross and I am dying on the cross, there will be a cost to you. And he says just before this, "Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Now, all of that has nothing to do with time management and project management for civil engineering. But the interesting thing here is he uses an analogy from civil engineering where he basically says you would be a laughing stock. People will ridicule you and laugh at you if you start building a tower, but then you run out of money and you can't complete it. Do the wise thing and sit down first and consider if you have the money to complete it. do a liquidity analysis, and the sad thing is that never happens in Kurdistan. A lot of what I'm telling you is a crossover between cost management and time management. They're very much related here. So, a lot of the problems that I've shown you, particularly with the banking system, you're not going to be able to fix those. It's above your pay grade, my pay grade. That's something for banks and governments to fix. But what can project teams do to help fix this and to potentially help gather the investment in so that you have liquidity, so that there aren't the same delays in project delivery? Well, one of the things you can do is you can actually have better accounting. Do a liquidity test. This is the most basic level of accounting. Anyone should be able to do this, and you should be doing this right at the start of a project, working out when you need cash, how much and when, so that you have an idea of what kind of investment you need to raise. And then, once you've got that, you can start raising the investment, start looking for investors ahead of time. Now, there are difficulties with investors waiting for progress and everything, but having good accounting and having good liquidity, that will help you in the long run. It also would potentially be of benefit to have an investment fund manager, someone who's constantly trying to get investment even as the project is progressing. The next thing is have better communication with prospective investors, and this is where I say have Gantt charts. Show that you've got a good schedule that you're trying to keep to. Now, you may fail in places, you may get behind schedule in places, but remember what I said. Gantt charts are a good means of communicating with project team members, and the investors are part of the project team. And so investors, as I said, their biggest risk for the investor, it's got nothing to do with Daesh, it's got nothing to do with corruption. Their biggest risk with investing in Kurdistan is in delays in the project. If someone came to me and asked me to invest in their real estate project, and I said, well, what's your schedule? And they said, oh, it'll be done in July 2023. And I said, okay, show me your schedule. And they say, what do you mean? And I say, well, have you got a Gantt chart or a critical pathway analysis? And they say, we don't know what you're talking about. I will then say, well, how did you come to that date, July 2023? They'll probably say, oh, we just hope it'll be done by then. I have no confidence. You've just picked that due date, that project delivery date out of thin air. I can't trust you. Gantt charts are a way of building trust. You can show to the investors you've actually thought about what needs to be done, and how much time is needed. And so it gives investors more confidence in the delivery date that you're proposing. The other option is build modular. Now, this is a little bit more difficult to picture, but this is where Floria City is heading. Look at the building on the right there. Now, this is actually a high-rise building that it's been designed in a special way so that basically every time someone wants to buy an apartment, they can basically just build another story on top of that building. And basically they can actually build up to 6 stories. But this is modular, meaning that you can sell it in small sections. So rather than with a high-rise building like Star Apartments, where you've got to build it at many, many millions of dollars, and only after it is finished completely can people move in. With modular, you could build 1 floor, and then people can move in. And then once you've raised enough investment, you can actually build another floor, and then people can move into that floor. And then when you've raised enough investment, you can build a third floor, and so on and so on. What is the difference? Well, the difference is that you're earning rent the moment you complete one floor. And so it's a way of when you're waiting to get investors for the next phase of a project, it isn't costing you as much because you're getting rent from the previous phase, so to speak. In fact, the rents from that could potentially fund the next part of the project. So that's what we mean when we talk about modular building or modular projects. Basically, different parts of the project are done on repeat. So Floria City is going that way now. So basically, you can buy this, you can pay money, and they will fix and finish up one villa for you, and then you can move in. And then with that money, they can pay their debts. But then someone else will come along and pay some money, and then they can finish off another villa, and so on and so on. They can't do that, of course, with the high-rise apartment. I can't look at a skeleton of a high-rise and say, I want that apartment, and they can build that apartment, and then the rest of the building is empty and uninhabitable. That's not possible. So modular building. The other thing you can do to encourage investment is you can give a discount for early investment. And this is something that Star Apartments have done. They struggled for a long time to get the funds for the latest part of their project. But what they've done quite successfully, I understand, talking with someone in that project, is that they've offered a discount for early investment. Basically, they've been selling people apartments already before it's sold, and they're saying you can have an apartment for 150,000 and it'll be finished by December 2020. And they're saying, well, how do we know it's finished by December 2020? We don't have any guarantee, so yeah, we're not keen to invest. And so one thing they could do is give a guarantee, but because they don't have good time management, they won't do that. So another way to attract the investment is to give a discount. Say, okay, if you buy it this week, this month, it won't be 150,000, it'll be 125,000 or something. And then maybe people are willing to buy the apartments, invest into the project, because even though they know there's a risk, there could be a project delay, they're willing to take that risk because of the discount they're getting for being an early investor. So that's one way you can fix it, and that's what a lot of project teams do on the sponsor side of things. So that's another example of modular building. This is actually a picture from Mexico City. And so you can see that they're building villas that are all identical. And what they've done, they're not building all of those villas in one go and then trying to sell them. They're building one villa at a time. And when it's completed, someone will buy it and then they can start on the next one, and so on and so on. And also when you're doing modular building like that and everything is exactly the same, suddenly you start going into production management mode rather than project management. And so quality control, cost control, time control becomes a lot easier. The 100th house you build, you're going to finish in a lot less time and probably at better quality and even lower cost than the first house you build. So you've got those advantages too. So there is another thing that can happen in Kurdistan when you don't have a bank a good bank to invest in a project. You can go to private investors, but the other thing is the government. the government, the KRG government, often takes the place of a bank and will invest in private projects. Now, you're probably thinking, why would the government ever do this? Well, potentially the government is going to be earning interest. There will be money to be made by being a shareholder in the project, but also they are interested in the external benefits of the private project. Namely, it might be fiscal stimulus, meaning it will create jobs. The other thing is it may be good for the tourism industry if there's good hotels tourists can stay in, and so on and so on. So an example of a private project that the government has invested in would be American Village. So that's out towards Tarrant Hills. That's out toward on the Massif Road. Now, there has been a lot of criticism over this because basically you're using a public entity, namely the government, to do what usually private entities, namely banks, do. And just like we talked about in economics, the private free market usually has a way of getting to more efficient outcomes and more efficient price settings than public entities. Now, one of the real big concerns, and actually the UN has pointed this out, is that who is getting government funding? There does seem to be a little bit of tribalism and Worcester and favoritism and corruption, where basically if you have a cousin in the government, it's going to be easier for you to potentially get the government mortgage for your project. And so the government is investing in the people, in the projects which are run by the people they have the closest relationship with, rather than the best projects. And so that's one problem with this. So arguably American Village wasn't the best possible outcome for the government to invest in. Potentially it would have been better for them to invest in other areas. I'm not sure. I'm not a politician or an economist. But there is that argument. The other issue is that money is paid in phases, and this is the same with banks and with private investors. But often, what will happen is the government will say, "Okay, we've agreed we will invest in American Village, we will invest in your shopping mall that you're building, let's say." And they will basically say, we're not going to hand over all of the money for the shopping mall right away because you don't need it. You're not going to have all of your expenses on day one, but we're going to give it to you gradually so that the capital curve is always above the expenditure curve in your liquidity analysis. And so money is paid in phases. And so let's say you finish the foundation of your shopping mall, and the government has paid $100,000 for that, and you spend $100,000, build the foundation, and then you phone up the government and say the foundation is done. Now, can you give me another $100,000 for the superstructure? And the government says, okay, yeah, sure, we'll do that. We just need someone to come out and inspect that you've done the foundation and you've done what you said, which is fair. The government can do that. But when are they going to come? There's going to be delays. There's going to be bureaucracy. Potentially more than one government department is going to need to sign over the next payment of the next phase, and so on and so on. I needed to visit 68 government offices to get my car registered in Kurdistan. It's an incredible level of bureaucracy. Can you imagine the level of bureaucracy you would need to go to get government investment in a shopping mall that's many millions of dollars? You just can't imagine it. And the government, the KRG government, to their credit, they have done good work to try and address this, and I'll talk about that later. They're doing much better than they used to. The other issue is with government investment, you have the same issue with private investors and a lack of security. What happens if there's an economic crisis? The funding could be lost and all these projects could be put on hold. So, this is a fictional conversation between the project team of a fictional project and the Ministry of Development, who are investing in the project. So the project team phones up and says, phase 1 is complete. Can you please send the money for phase 2? Ministry of Development, first we need to inspect phase 1 to make sure it is done. Project team, can you come tomorrow? Ministry of Development, inshallah. Well, I can tell you what, that's a comical and fictional conversation, but that is a huge reason for delays in projects, because the Ministry of Development, they generally, I don't think people recognize the opportunity cost of time. And so they're often not in a rush to come out and check. And so that's just creating all sorts of delays on the project. You end up with big gaps between your bars in the Gantt chart, which delay the project. It's a huge reason why things such as in a typical apartment complex here in Erbil will take many years to build, rather than just a few months like most of the world, or even a few weeks in the case of China. One of the big issues is liquidity and having to buy, trying to get investment as the project is going along. But the other issue is actually just government bureaucracy and slow, sluggard government behaviour. Now, this also happens with building inspection. So when you build a building for like a big apartment building, you also need to make sure that the building is done to a legal standard so it can withhold earthquakes and so forth. And so not only the Ministry of Development, but also the Ministry of Housing and Construction, they need to send their engineers at certain stages of the construction and review the work and sign it off and say, okay, now you can do the masonry, and so on. And that's normal. But when they are delaying the project, that's a big problem. I'll tell you what, in New Zealand, in America, the UK, and not only those countries, but also Tonga, and also South Africa, and also, no, it hasn't happened in Oman, but those are countries I've worked in as a civil engineer. I can tell you that if the government needed to send a building inspector to inspect the building, or a government investor to inspect the building, if they delayed the project, we could sue the government. We would charge the government a penalty for delaying the project. We can do that. Of course, Kurdistan, you can't do that. The KRG, I don't really think you would have much chance of suing the government. But that basically gives you another reason why there's big delays in projects. So how can we fix this? One of the things you can do is again, there isn't much we can do entirely. A lot of this banks and governments need to fix as well, but give prior notice to the inspectors. Don't say, hey, we finished phase 1, can you come today? Say, hey, will you have someone ready on this date? Please make sure someone is here to inspect so we can continue. Have good communication, Gantt charts. That's one of the things you can do to give that prior notice. Also, I really don't know if this is going to work in the Kurdish context, but normally when you have an inspector coming in, if they give you a delay to the project, you can charge them a penalty which is proportional to the cost of that delay. You can. That's how most countries work. Now, so you could basically threaten the government with a stick if they don't come. I don't know how well that's going to work, but another way is to go the other way. Rather than trying to work with a stick, you work with a carrot and you give a reward for early delivery. Basically say, we will pay you a bit more if you can do this in a timely fashion. Now, you've got to be careful about how you do that, because I think there's a lot of bribery and corruption that could potentially happen with building inspections. But so long as everything is very open and clear and written, so you're not paying people under the table, then I think that might be a way that you can stop governments from and any inspectors giving delays to a project. Now, another issue is something called free land or very subsidized land. Now, normally in the KRG, when the government is trying to stimulate growth, it will actually invest into projects, not necessarily by giving cash. That was done some time back. It's not done as much as it is in the past. But what they will do is they will give land. And this goes up and down. Many people in Erbil are living in houses that they didn't buy the land for. Basically, the government gave them the land, and then they've built a house. Now, that's the government's prerogative. What they were trying to do was stimulate the economy when basically Kurdistan had to start up as a country. So that's not necessarily right or wrong, but I'm going to talk about one of the costs of that. Now, potentially, you're a developer and you're saying, I want to build a high-rise car park and then make money off the car parks. The government, interested in this because of the fiscal stimulus it's going to bring, they give you money to buy the land. Or they don't give you money, they give you land. Now, the big issue here is potentially you realize you're never going to make any money, or not a lot of money anyway, from renting out car spaces. Where you are really going to be making money is from capital gains. That land that you gave $0 to, or maybe a very discounted price you didn't give a lot of money to, over time that's going to go up in value. And so that is going to be that is where the money is. It's not in the business, it's not in the car parks, it's in the value of the land. And so what this does is it potentially creates white elephants. Potentially there is no demand for a high-rise car park. No one is going to use it, or very few people. The business could be running at a loss. And so that's what a white elephant is. It is something that no one asked for, but we got anyway. So back in the year, many centuries ago, in Thailand, Malaysia, it was considered a very honourable gift to receive a white elephant, because the king would give you a white elephant to honour someone. Now, but it means nothing. No, white elephants aren't actually that much use. They keep getting sunburned, but you got it anyway. So that's what a white elephant is. But the investor, the businessman who started this project, he doesn't care, because one day he's going to sell the land for many millions of dollars. and make money that way. So he's not interested in the business so much as the value of the land, that so long as he occupies it, he can actually he can make money off the land in capital gains. You know what I mean by capital gains? When the value of your land goes up in value through the years. So that can create a white elephant. So this is an example of a white elephant. Now, in this example, the government is giving money for the investment because they for the project, because they basically are trying to create fiscal stimulus here. They're trying to stimulate the economy rather than land. But you get the idea. A businessman tells the government he can build a state-of-the-art mall in Halabja for $30 million. Now, the government gives him $30 million for the project. Now, the businessman then builds it at a low cost and low quality for $25 million. The man walks away $5 million richer. And no one ever visits the mall. There was never demand for a huge shopping mall in Halabja. Not enough people live there. But is the businessman happy? Yeah. Is he actually a businessman? Well, not really. He's a con man, and he's basically conned the gullible government. The government has invested in a project which really doesn't have a lot of benefit to society. But the businessman was always thinking, I'm going to be making money from the government overpaying me for this project, rather than rents and selling shops in the mall. That's how I'm going to be making money. So that's an example of a white elephant. Not such a big issue like this. Is an example that happens all the time in the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Oman. Not so much in Kurdistan. In Kurdistan, it's usually done with land. So with land, a man tells the government he wants to build a state-of-the-art mall in Halabja, and the government gives him 20 hectares of land to build the mall. The businessman might build the mall, or he might begin to build the mall, very low cost. He might get as far as building the skeleton of the mall. So basically, the government won't question him and say, "Oh, you're not doing it. We'll take the land off you." He'll do the minimal, but probably the mall will never open, or if it does, it'll be minimal. And then one day he's going to sell the land to an oil company who've discovered that there's oil under that land for several $1 million, and he's rich that way. He never cared about actually developing the land. He'll develop the land only to stay in the government's favour, but he'll try and do that at minimal cost to him, and so it'll be minimal quality, and it will also be a lot of time. All of this influences the cost constraint, quality constraint, but also the time constraint. So that's what a white elephant is. And there is a little bit of white elephantism happening with a lot of projects in Erbil. It's a phenomena that is happening usually in places which are historically poor and have suddenly come into a lot of money because of natural resources. So that's Kurdistan. That's the Middle East generally. The Middle East is famous for its white elephants. It's not so common in places where there's more of a private and more of a free market, and people don't go to the government. They're looking for private investors or bank investors, and those entities are a lot more careful about investing, and they don't invest in white elephants to the same degree. So that's an example of a white elephant. So it can be with land or it can be with money. So I want you to know that the government, a lot of these problems, the government is doing a pretty good job of fixing them. So one of the things that's happening is In 2018, they started telling people who had been given land for development, and basically the land wasn't being developed. There were a lot of half-finished buildings. The government said, if you don't develop it like you said you did, we're going to take over, we're going to confiscate the land and develop it ourselves, or knock down the superstructure that you've built and give it to someone else. And so suddenly everyone's building the projects again. So that's one thing the government is doing. The other thing the government is doing is actually really good work with the Kurdistan Board of Investment. If you've never checked this out, check out this website. This is a government entity where they, rather than waiting for investors to come to them and say, I want to build a shopping mall in Halabja, will you help us? They are already identifying good projects where there is good benefit, good profits to be made, and they're basically then asking for investors to come in and to partner with them in developing these projects. So there's all sorts of really good projects there. There's cement factories, there's shopping malls, there's tourist resorts, and the government will be part owner with you in those projects. And the fantastic thing with this is that all of the government permissions, all of the bureaucracy, that is sorted out prior by the Kurdistan Board of Investment. And so delays in the project, the time management with members of the government coming and checking to make sure you're building it correctly, potentially it's going to be internalized. The external cost of time delays is internalized into the government. So this is a really good move, and this is a very good part of the Kurdistan government, the Board of Investment. They're doing great work at identifying good investment opportunities and then asking people to partner with them in delivering those projects. I will say, though, that they are only looking at projects of $1 million plus. So, it's not really something for poor university lecturers like me. I could not be involved in such a project. But, yeah, that's something to consider too. So, guys, that's the end of time management. 3 lectures. I will be giving you an assignment 6. I will probably be writing that today or tomorrow. It'll be due next week, and it will be your final assignment. I'm only giving you 6 assignments. I'll be too busy in week 9 writing your exams. So next lecture we're going to be looking at quality management, and we'll probably do that for 2 lectures. Now, if you've got any questions about time management, please let me know. Much of assignment 6 will be focused on you. One of the key questions will be on you producing a critical pathway method. Okay, so think about that. If you've got any questions, if anything in this lecture has been unclear, please let me know. I realise this has been going on for an hour and a half. I promise you the next lecture will be shorter than this. Thank you, and God bless.